I've been a fan of comic books for, without exaggeration, my entire life. When I was a kid, comics were all I read, wrote, and talked about. And even today, they remain an important part of who I am and how I relate myself to popular culture.
Oh, where'd she go? It's just like that issue of X-Men where Storm just wrecks Cyclops. It's just like that. Chris Claremont, why haven't you been answering my emails?
I say all of this to make one thing clear. I thought I understood comics, not just their characters, but their history, their development, their beginnings, and how they evolved into what they are today. I thought I did, but in truth, I only knew half of the story. In fact, it would be safe to say that this project has completely recontextualized my understanding of the medium I love. I began studying French comic books, or bandes-dessinées, with a single, simple question. Why aren't superheroes as popular in France as they are in America? That turned out to be a relatively simple question to answer, which we'll get to, but it opened up so many more, like how do these two forms, these two countries, intersect socially, culturally, artistically, and ideologically? What are the reasons for these connections, and how did they contribute to the industry today? We'll get to all of that, but first we should start at the beginning. Part 1. The Origin Story. Comics have a muddy origin, with lots of different countries and cultures taking credit for the quote-unquote creation of the medium. Though, as Scott McCloud points out in his book Understanding Comics, sequential art has existed long before the printed page and modern Western society. The earliest examples McCloud provides being from Mixtec codices and Egyptian hieroglyphics. However, for our purposes, we'll assume that comics as we know them originate in Europe in the mid to late 1800s, more or less as evolutions of the political cartoon or caricature magazine, with the publication of L'Histoire de Monsieur Vieuxbois by Swiss author Rodolphe Töpfer, nowadays considered the father of the modern comic, coming first in 1827, and the American equivalent, The Yellow Kid, following in the New York World paper in 1895. At this time, and for the foreseeable future, comics in France and in America are considered primarily children's publications. In the early 1910s, the American funny book is confined to newspaper strips, which will eventually evolve into the Sunday funny papers, while in France, different series are published collectively in specialized anthology magazines devoted to bande dessinée, such as Le Petit Français Illustré, and later collected into individual albums if a series performs well. Things truck along like this for a while before we enter the 1930s and the golden age of comic books. Part 2. The Golden Age. During the 1930s, American comics start to blow up. Famous Funnies, considered by many to be the first American comic book anthology magazine, is published in 1934, the same year that National Comics, the predecessor to what we now know as DC Comics, is founded. Newspaper syndicates such as King Features and United Features begin publishing adventure stories like Tarzan, The Phantom, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and so on, which achieve great success in the US and then begin serialization overseas. By the mid-1930s, strips like the soon-to-be sensational Tintin are just beginning their serialization in Europe, when the European comic book world becomes flooded with American imports, beginning with French journalist Paul Winkler's Opéra Mundi, a distributor modeled after the American King Features, and its serialization of Disney's characters in Le Journal de Mickey. This spread of American comics continues well into the middle of the decade. According to bande dessinée historian Ann Miller, the American strips offered spectacular excitement, from the exoticism of Tarzan, drawn by Hal Foster and then Bern Hogarth, to the science fiction scenarios of Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon and William Ritt and Clarence Gray's Brick Bradford, mythical figures of the American male, more virile than their French counterparts. In 1938, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman makes his debut in the now famous Action Comics #1, which all but revolutionizes the American industry. No one has ever read anything like this before, and as Action Comics goes on, Superman's popularity drives monthly sales into the millions. In response, National Comics begins to experiment with other superheroes. Detective Comics number 27 introduces Batman a year later, and others, such as Wonder Woman and Aquaman, as well as the original incarnations of The Flash, Green Lantern, and the prototype super team Justice Society, appearing in the early days of the 1940s. This is the birth of the genre that would come to dominate the pop culture of the 21st century, and it's about to explode. As the decade winds down, American comics' foothold in the European market seems unshakable, and with the superhero genre on the rise, it shows no signs of stopping. However, what comes next all but amputates the influx of American strips into Europe, and inadvertently changes the course of comic book history. Part 3. Moral Panic. In 1939, the year that births Marvel's predecessor Timely Comics, and just 1 year after Superman, interestingly retitled Marque Hercule Moderne makes his European debut in the French-Belgian Spirou magazine, World War II begins, and another year later in 1940, Paris falls to the German army and the Nazis occupy France. Meanwhile, American comics are quick to comment on the war, with the first appearance of Captain America, created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, coming in 1941, a year before the U.S. military joins the conflict. Kirby and Simon's creation stems from a place of outrage and catharsis. As the children of Jewish immigrants themselves, they were repulsed by the actions of Nazi Germany and felt the need to speak up. Other publications follow suit, with most of the popular superheroes of the day taking part, especially once the U.S. joins the war. Unsurprisingly, the Nazis begin to heavily censor and outright restrict the imports coming from America. As a consequence, Mark the Modern Hercules and his fellow American publications gradually vanish from the pages of French magazines. By 1945, the occupation is over, and with France unified and open to the rest of the world again, American imports begin to trickle back in, but they don't thrive in the post-war climate. And it's here, I think, that we come to the answer of my initial question: why aren't superheroes as popular in France as in America? The answer is due, in part, to the rise of Gaullism, a political ideology named for President Charles de Gaulle, intended to restore the French people's pride in their nation after their humiliation during the war. Gaullism is defined by its insular, almost nationalist ideals, as in essence, Gaullism sought to unify France's people in a way that transcended party lines and political division, to restore France to its former position as a center of militaristic and cultural power in Europe, but especially to create a culturally sovereign and internally united France, independent of outside influence and particularly one strong enough to defend itself from further defeat and occupation. This culturally insular climate would prove inhospitable to the American superhero genre, which already had its roots in propaganda and by now is only becoming bolder in its patriotism. And as these strips begin to return to French magazines, a moral panic arises. These comics are seen as devoid of any educational value and essentially as indoctrinating the youth to American ways of thinking. And beyond that, these American strips are seen as a threat to the careers of French artists. This leads to La Loi du 16 juillet 1949 sur les publications destinées à la jeunesse, a law intended to govern and regulate the stories that could be published in French comics in order to prevent the corruption of the youth. Now, if you know your American comic book history, this might be starting to sound eerily familiar. But for those who don't, in late 1940s America, similar accusations of comic books' corrupting influence begin to bubble up, leading to a growing culture of hysteria, book burnings, and cries for censorship, a climate that psychologist Frederick Wertham capitalizes on in 1954 when he publishes Seduction of the Innocent, a 397-page-long screed lampooning comic books as the source of all juvenile delinquency. This book strikes a chord, and parents across the nation lose their collective minds. Things get so bad that the government actually starts a full-on inquiry into the comic book industry. In an effort to avoid being subject to government legislation, the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers, a trade group which had already been formed by industry leaders to combat the early controversies, evolves into the Comics Code Authority, a far stricter organization which would serve as an editorial, read, censorship board to appease the pearl-clutching masses and allow the comics industry to remain in business. As we move into the mid-1950s, both France and America are dominated by these restrictive editorial policies, and the seeds of discontent are sown. Part 4. Culture. American comics begin to buckle beneath the weight of the public scrutiny brought about by Seduction of the Innocent and the newfound regulations of the Comics Code. Many of the popular superheroes that were introduced in the 1940s, such as the Flash, Green Lantern, and other members of the short-lived Justice Society, fall into obscurity, and very few persist into the 1950s. Meanwhile, large swaths of the industry are now terra non grata to the general public. Horror comics, for example, which had previously proven popular, are now all but forbidden under the code's puritanical restrictions. As a result, the American comic book industry enters a state of limbo, and it won't be for another decade that the resurgence of the Silver Age will truly kick off. Back in Europe, however, Franco-Belgian bandes-dessinées are entering a second golden age in the absence of American strips. Belgian artist Hergé's comic book Tintin, which began publication in 1929, has become something of a pop culture powerhouse. Each volume of the series is massively popular, allowing Tintin to eventually expand into its own magazine, which would provide not only content from new authors, but 1 to 2 page previews of the upcoming Tintin volume to keep readers coming back. Spirou returns to the publishing world with titles such as Buck Danny and the Smurfs, and later on in 1959, Pilote magazine is founded, which will go on to achieve massive heights of popularity with series like Astérix, a comedy strip set in the early history of France. The massive success of Astérix is likely due directly to the nationalist climate of the time as well. Astérix is a Gaullist, not in the political sense, but the historical one, an inhabitant of Gaul, the region that eventually became present-day France after a period of conflict and eventual occupation by the Romans. The image of Astérix, a representation of what one might call a Français de souche, a quote-unquote natural-born Frenchman, triumphing over and outsmarting a bumbling, cartoonishly evil occupying force, must have been particularly appealing to a post-war France trying to pull itself back together. But let's return to Tintin for a second. The influence of Hergé's stories, both culturally and technically, can't really be understated. As an artist, Hergé was extremely talented, pioneering his own unique style, which he referred to as the ligne claire. Essentially, ligne claire, meaning clear line in English, is defined by its caricatured, simplified character designs, juxtaposed with extremely detailed and technically complex backgrounds. This art makes the comic as accessible as possible to its readers, likely contributing to the breadth of Tintin's success. The simplicity of the character designs makes them incredibly versatile, allowing them to fit into any scene or context Hergé can think of, and makes it easy for the reader to be swept up into the strange locales that Tintin's adventures often lead. What's more, the individual panel layouts are composed almost entirely of moment-to-moment transitions, with linearity and comprehensibility being of utmost importance. This creates dense but immensely readable pages. Technically speaking, Tintin and the ligne claire style he represents would prove immensely popular, with an entire generation of artists taking direct inspiration from it. Culturally speaking, similar to characters we see in American comics of the time such as Captain America, Tintin serves as something of a sounding board for the popular politics of the day. When Hergé's adventure comic first hit the stands at the dawn of the 1930s, it was essentially conservative propaganda. Tintin's very first volume, Tintin au Pays des Soviets, was thoroughly anti-communist, and the follow-up, Tintin au Congo, is now infamous for its extremely racist portrayal of African people and its civilizing mission messaging. As he moves into the late 1950s, the anti-Soviet messaging continues, but gradually, Hergé would become fascinated with scientific progress and space travel, something that would come to define the coming decade. While Tintin's success is due in no small part to Hergé's talent for writing and drawing, and while we'll never know if the French would have completely resisted the influence of the dawning golden age of the American superhero without the impact of the war, I think one can safely assume that the ecosystem that Tintin's adventure serials entered and thrived in was created in part by the earlier imports of American stories and the vacuum they left during the occupation. Regardless, Tintin is monumentally successful, and with his squeaky clean character archetype and conformist politics, he serves as the perfect poster boy for the European comic book scene at the time, and by the 1960s, some are starting to get sick of him. Part 5. Counterculture. Over in America, despite the limitations of the Comics Code, Marvel Comics make their debut with the first issue of the Fantastic Four in 1961, offering a reinvention of the superhero genre that had begun to grow tiresome. The FF and the Marvel heroes that follow indicate a more nuanced take on the previously infallible superhero archetype. Marvel's characters have personal struggles beyond the villains they fight, from such simple things as paying rent, being bullied, and pursuing romantic partners, to facing social discrimination, living with disabilities, and struggling with self-image. This humanization of what had previously been vehicles for simple, action-packed stories proves to be the innovation necessary to reinvigorate public interest in the genre. This comes just after DC Comics introduces the first incarnation of the Justice League, which revitalizes many of the characters that had been on editorial life support throughout most of the 1950s, such as Green Lantern, The Flash, and Aquaman, kicking off the rivalry between the two companies that continues to this day. Before we go any further, though, we have to talk about two of the most important figures of the mainstream American comic book world, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. Both had been in the industry for quite a long time by this point, but it's with the birth of Marvel Comics that they become the legendary figures they are today. By the middle of the Silver Age, Kirby and Lee are drawing and writing almost every book coming out of Marvel, and Kirby's iconic style, defined by his strong character posing, dynamic action, and technical innovation, is quickly adopted as the house art style of the company. The Fantastic Four proved to be a great success, and Marvel's publishers demand more superheroes more frequently, leading Kirby and Lee to create Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Mighty Thor, the Uncanny X-Men, and the Avengers, among others. This sort of thing has been the standard of the American industry for a while now, and is likely another reason why the superhero never quite took off in France. In America at this time, comics are driven by popularity and profitability, not so much by artistry. When horror was popular, artists wrote and drew horror. When adventure stories and westerns were popular, that's what filled the shelves. And now, superheroes are what's hot, so they're what's being written. And superheroes in particular, with their cavalcade of iconic, brightly colored, eye-catching outfits, have always made effective advertisers, where once they sold war bonds, now they sell fruit pies. While it would be foolish to say that France's artists aren't driven by profit margins themselves, France has always had slightly more respect for the medium of comic books and for its artists' visions, even with the censorship that La Loi du Juillet 1949 entailed. The model of American hyper-commercialism that the superhero represents simply doesn't gel with French ideals, which, generally speaking, value art for the sake of artistic pursuit and not for its commercial value. The point is that, by now, despite the genius innovations that Jack Kirby contributed to the form, editorially speaking, American comic books are driven almost entirely by profit and not so much by artistic expression. And with the strict regulations of the Comics Code still in place, as well as the general countercultural attitude of the 60s, a storm begins to brew, one that takes the form of the American underground comics movement. Made up largely by independent publications such as Bijou Funnies, Gothic Blimpworks, and Zap, and spearheaded by artists such as Robert Crumb, the underground comics movement seems intended almost as a response to each of the points that Seduction of the Innocent posited, and that the Comics Code maintained. These comics are full of sex, violence, and anti-capitalist ideas, hence the X in the name. Obviously, the majority of these works are printed independently on cheap stock and are circulated only within small groups of artists. Due to this, and to the editorial practices still in place in established publishing, they don't achieve mainstream popularity just yet. But make no mistake, the wave of underground experimental comics is growing, and growing fast. Meanwhile, in France, Tintin and Gaullist thought have dominated French culture for nearly 2 decades now, and the cracks are starting to form. As the decade goes on, an undercurrent of resentment for the Gaullist majority and for political conformity, along with global movements for social change, such as the sexual revolution and the American civil rights movement, begin to bleed into bandes-dessinées, a change that we can see occur in the comic books of the time, which seem to be fusions of the pulpy American adventure stories that predated the occupation, as well as the artistic choices and narrative style of Tintin and his Ligne Claire. Barbarella, for example, who appears in 1962, is a sexually liberated space adventurer in the vein of Flash Gordon, who uses her sexuality to manipulate her opponents. Several years later, in 1967, Valérian et Laureline make their debut in Pilote, and it is in this series that we really see a distillation of the changing political climate of the time, as the writer-artist duo of Valérian, Pierre Christin and Jean-Claude Mézières, explicitly set out to create a series in response to Gaullism and to Tintin. Very deliberately, Clistin says, I wanted to go against all those characters who were dominating the market at the time. The Franco-Belgian Boy Scout tradition, the fearless knight in shining armor, like Tintin. I also thought, and still do, that back then comics were politically very conformist, if not quite reactionary. The political context was Gaullism. I despised all those things, and I yearned, like so many people from my generation, for change. Valerian takes place in the 28th century, a time of great prosperity for humankind, which arose out of the ashes of the so-called Dark Age of the 21st century, our time, which, within the reality of the story, was explicitly destroyed by climate change, unregulated capitalism, and nuclear warfare. Valerian himself, though he is the main character, is an almost complete reversal of Tintin. He is clumsy, at times nigh on incapable, and must almost always be saved by his much more competent female counterpart, Laureline. When we first meet him and his fellow agent spatio-temporel, Valerian, a white man, is not portrayed as inherently superior to his co-workers, a black woman and Asian man, but as an equal. In fact, almost as inferior to them due to his bumbling nature. What's more, the most famous Valerian storyline, The City of a Thousand Planets, ends with the deposition of the deceitful ruling class and the installation of a government run by a workers' union. Not so subtle, huh? These countercultural sentiments would come to an explosive head in 1968, a year after Valerian and Laureline released, in the events of Mai 68, a period of intense civil unrest which nearly results in a full-on socialist revolution. At the movement's peak, over 7 million people go on strike and join the demonstrations in the streets, and the resulting uproar actually causes President de Gaulle to flee the country. While this only ends up strengthening the Gaullist government in the snap election that follows, the French people now have a hyper-awareness of their society's class divisions and a renewed resentment of institutional authority. According to Gaia Tripoli of the New York Times, the established hierarchy and formality that permeated relationships between teachers and students, parents and children, bosses and workers, and ultimately even politicians and citizens had been upended. Even today, the events of Mai 68 are considered a turning point for French society. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre would describe this movement to one of its leaders, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, as something that amazes, shakes up, and denies everything that has made our society what it is today. This is what I will call an extension of the field of possibilities. Like the occupation before it, this cultural upheaval would change the course of the comic book industry, both in France and in America. Part 6. Rebellion. Growing out from the shadow of Mai 68, the 1970s mark a period of rebellion for French comic book artists, as well as a desire to be taken seriously as an art form. While French artists aren't held to as tight a standard as their American counterparts at this point, and despite the French value of art for art's sake, French comics have struggled since their origin to throw off the label of children's entertainment. This is why the medium was so heavily censored in the first place, why editorial policies were so strict. The higher-ups still assume that their target audience is children, but the artists know that more is possible and are beginning to tire of the restraints being placed upon them. In the first half of the decade, countercultural magazine Actuel, which was founded in 1967, begins to publish comics from the American underground, such as Robert Crumb, who by now had become one of the most visible and influential members of the movement, introducing the French artistic community, already primed by the events of Mai 68, to a whole new way of writing bandes-dessinées, one that rebelled against every limitation previously placed on the medium. In 1975, a number of contributors to Pilote, the aforementioned publisher of Astérix, and by this point one of the biggest bande-dessinée magazines in France, depart due to editorial limitations and, inspired by the underground works that had popped up in Actuel, found Édition du Fromage, a company that goes on to publish L'Echo des Savants, which proudly bears an adults-only label on its front. While this publication doesn't last long, it's the first of many adult-only publications to follow, the most important and iconic of which being Métal Hurlant, the brainchild of artists Moebius, Philippe Trouillet, and Jean-Pierre Dionnet. Within the pages of Métal Hurlant, a generation of social and artistic repression explodes. Its pages teem at once with the sex, violence, and radical spirituality of Moebius's otherworldly science fiction, as well as the nuanced, tongue-in-cheek social commentary of Chantal Montelier's 1996. Mobius, in particular, is now considered a legendary figure, both in France and in America. In his works, one can see a near-complete inversion of every technique that Hergé pioneered in Tintin. The ligne claire has been all but abandoned, with Mobius's characters just as detailed as his backgrounds, sometimes grotesquely so. What's more, Mobius is not nearly as concerned with the accessibility of his texts. Gone are Hergé's carefully plotted and organized pages. Instead, one can see in Mobius's work a deliberate eschewing of traditional narrative structure and linearity in favor of a more instinctual, basal, and stream-of-consciousness mode of storytelling. Alzac, for example, is completely wordless, with no dialogue, narrative captions, or other manner of expository text being provided, creating a surreal, almost dreamlike reading experience, stuffed with imagery evocative of the most basal instincts of humankind. Le Garage Hermétique, meanwhile, does away with linearity almost completely, rapidly and frequently jumping from scene to scene and subject to subject, and even changing the designs and genders of his characters at random. In much of his work, Mobius injects social, artistic, and spiritual commentary, offering reflections on class division, gender and sexuality, the intertwined nature of good and evil, and even metatextual musings on his own role and power as an artist. With Metal Hurlant and artists like Mobius making waves, bandes-dessinées finally become a part of the literary conversation. Not only do most of the works coming out at this time include some form of social or literary commentary, as in the works of Mobius and Montelier, but also commentary and innovation on what had come before in the medium of comic books, allowing French bande dessinée to engage in conversation not only with other art forms, but with themselves and their own history. Jacques Tardi's Les Démons de Glace, for example, is a parody of the works of Jules Verne, drawn in an evolved ligne claire style. Around this time, a ligne crade emerges, pioneered by French cartoonist Philippe Vuillemin, which strives to directly contrast the ligne claire school of art. Mobius himself would return to the ligne claire in his later work, Le Monde des Dénas, in which the art style evolves from the ligne claire into Mobius's more detailed and complicated one over the course of the book. Though the hypersexualized and provocative nature of much of the material coming out at this time leads to more censorship, it isn't long before magazines start running stranger, more introspective, and more socially aware stories. Meanwhile, French publishing groups begin to roll out prestige hardcover volumes of bande dessinée, a step up compared to the early paperbacked collections of the earliest Tintin books, and other publications pop up detailing the history and legacy of the medium. In France, comic books have grown up. However, over in America, things are not going nearly as smoothly. Part 7. Worlds Collide. In contrast to France, the American comic book industry of the 1970s can be best described as stagnating. Interest in comic books is at a definite low point, as the continuing limitations of the Comics Code Authority mean that readers have been getting very similar stories for a very long time, and sales have been steadily dropping for years. And while some comics of the day rebel against the code and engage with more mature themes, they are very much in the minority. Smaller publications are dropping like flies, and Marvel and DC are, more or less, the last left standing. On the artistic side of things, Jack Kirby departs Marvel in the early days of the decade for their rival company, DC, and begins what many consider his magnum opus, the Fourth World Saga. And the artists that follow in his wake at Marvel are still expected to mirror his style as closely as possible, which creates a slightly homogenized art style across the company's works. From a business perspective, this makes sense. Superheroes, of course, need to remain as identifiable and iconic as possible, and no one could draw a more iconic superhero than Jack Kirby. But you only have to look at the works of the artists that follow him to see that there is very little distinction between them on a surface level. I would never go so far as to call these artists untalented or this art style boring, but it's clear that the artistic experimentation that defined France at the time is all but absent in these popular American works. In this period of stagnation, the mainstream industry takes notice of the underground comics movement, which has, by now, found itself between a rock and a hard place. As the movement gains traction, it gains notoriety, and soon enough finds itself subjected to legal battles and editorial mandates protesting its provocative material. What's more, tensions arise within the community itself as artists begin to put more of a focus on generating a profit, contributing designs and artwork to films, and pursuing publications in magazines such as Playboy and National Lampoon, all of which culminate in the classic accusation of selling out. This is not to say that the era is without innovation. The visibility of more complex ideas in the underground comics work inspire Will Eisner, a cartoonist who would later become an industry legend in his own right, to write A Contract with God, often cited as one of, if not the first, mainstream graphic novel, which achieves modest success, though bookstores struggle to find a place for it on their shelves, as even at this point they have never seen anything quite like it. In an effort to combat their mutual stagnation, the mainstream and underground comics industries come together, with Marvel publishing neutered underground work in its short-lived Comics Book magazine. These efforts are obviously unsuccessful and breed still more resentment from the artists in the underground community. In effect, the underground comics movement has found itself right back where it started, as artistry is restricted by social moralism and profitability. Art Spiegelman, himself an underground artist who had both created and contributed to various magazines during the heyday of the movement, and who will very soon become a legendary name himself, grows particularly dissatisfied. What had seemed like a revolution simply deflated into a lifestyle, he said. Underground comics were stereotyped as dealing only with sex, dope, and cheap thrills. They got stuffed back into the closet along with bong pipes and love beads as things started to get uglier. It's around this time that Spiegelman meets Françoise Mully, a French-born architecture student visiting the US, who seeks Spiegelman out after reading some of his work in one of the various underground magazines still circulating, Arcade. The two hit it off, with Spiegelman eventually returning to France with her, and later marrying her to make her travels to and from France and the US easier. Together, the two of them begin to make yearly trips to France, each time bringing back more and more of the comics making waves in Europe at the time, including Métal Hurlant. And perhaps inspired by the sort of work they saw achieving mainstream success in France, the couple founds Raw magazine in 1980, a publication devoted to presenting underground and experimental comics work from both American and international artists in a prestige format, similar to what the French had been doing since the late 70s. At the same time, Métal Hurlant is translated into English and enters into the American market as heavy metal. Because they are packaged and distributed as magazines and not as comic books, both Raw and Heavy Metal are exempt from the regulations of the Comics Code. This not only means that they can publish essentially whatever they damn well want, but also that they're put on the shelves next to magazines like Playboy, The New Yorker, Esquire, National Lampoon, glossies as we call them, the high-tier stuff. The distinction couldn't be clearer. Comic books are not just for kids anymore. Together, these two magazines introduced the influence of European comic books into the American public, revolutionizing their perception of what's possible in the medium of comic books, with Raw publishing more sophisticated highbrow work, such as the early chapters of Spiegelman's graphic memoir Mouse, and Heavy Metal continuing to publish its trademark mind-bending, ultra-sexy, ultra-violent science fiction. For the first time, comics are receiving mainstream commercial attention and success in the US, with works like Mouse in particular achieving high praise for injecting nuance and maturity into the medium. Moving into the late 80s, the groundwork laid by Raw and Heavy Metal's success in the American market leads to DC Comics' early forays into darker, more adult-oriented stories, such as the 1-2 punch of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen in 1986, a darkly satiric deconstruction of the superhero genre, Moore and Gibbons both being early contributors to the underground comics movement themselves, and Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, a similarly dark revamp of Batman, who up until now was more well known for the campy Adam West TV series than for dark gothic mystery. This title was also the first DC book to be published in the so-called prestige format, similar to the volumes that had long been in practice in France, a mark of confidence by the editors in the book's potential despite its dark themes. These intersections between French artistry and the mainstream American comics industry are perhaps best represented in Marvel's 1988 miniseries Silver Surfer Parable, a direct collaboration between two of the figureheads of the French and American comic book worlds, Moebius and Stan Lee, a synthesis of the two men's best artistic abilities, with Moebius's incredible artwork and philosophical tendencies melding perfectly with Lee's penchant for grand Shakespearean dialogue. But it doesn't end there, far from it. The iconoclastic, anti-authoritarian, and anti-consumerist ideals that informed Raw and heavy metal, and therefore the decade of work that followed in their wake, would persist well into the 1990s, with the foundation of DC's Vertigo line, which, until its unfortunate cancellation in 2020, focuses on mature, often experimental work, not unlike the kind seen in heavy metal, and whose success would have been nigh on impossible if not for the environment that heavy metal and Raw created. Said famous comic book writer and former heavy metal editor-in-chief Grant Morrison, heavy metal Americanized the French aesthetic of Metal Hurlant, that comics version of the Nouvelle Vague, but the specifically European approach to the notion of adult science fiction comics, which could feature controversial ideas and more overt sexuality, certainly fed into the DNA of the British alternative scene that gave its blood to Vertigo in the 90s. Several years after Vertigo begins to gain momentum, in a striking parallel to the en masse departure of Pilote artists 30 years earlier, and directly inspired by the darker works that had come out of the late 80s, several of Marvel Comics' biggest moneymakers, including Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Eric Larson, each of whom responsible for the revitalization of Marvel's most iconic characters at the time, fed up with editorial limitations, abandoned the company to found their own, Image Comics, which carves out a third of the American comic book market for itself with early hits like Spawn, before later becoming the home of such series as Saga, Invincible, and The Walking Dead. And now, here we are, the modern age of comic books, an era brought about by the decades-long interplay between two countries on opposite sides of the world, an invisible cultural dance, and one which closely resembles the sort of wild, fearless invention and innovation that Metal Hurlant and the American Underground epitomized in their time. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Image is to the industry today what heavy metal was in the late 80s, the center for boundary-pushing, subversive, and inventive experimentation, as well as the sort of high-flying sci-fi and fantasy that one could expect from heavy metal. However, this sort of thing is no longer limited to independent publications, but has bled into established publishing. The big two, Marvel and DC, are now engaging with experimental and mature work much more frequently, where they had previously been afraid to. DC's recent hit, Mr. Miracle, by Tom King and Mitch Gerads, uses its titular superhero to speak on mental health, depression, suicide, and trauma. Over at Marvel, Silver Surfer Black by Donny Cates and Tradd Moore could easily be called a grandchild of Moebius's sweeping epics of psychedelic science fiction, exploring the nature of life, death, and reality. It even quotes Moebius and Lee's Parable. These days, comics across the publishing world have finally broken away from traditional superhero tales. Experimentation is no longer confined to the underground, but is being engaged with at every level of the industry, ranging from social and cultural and subcultural commentary to explorations of human nature and the human mind, from high-flying introspective sci-fi to pulpy, horror-tinged mythological fantasy, to even metatextual examinations of comics themselves. Sometimes they are all of these at once. All told, thanks to this mixture of French and American influences, it has never been a better time to be a comic book fan. And so the circle is complete. Where all of this began with American imports to France, it ends with French culture's impact on America. But what's the point? What does this say? Part 8. Conclusion. I thought that I understood comic books, and in that assumption I fell into the same trap that many people throughout the medium's history have. I underestimated them. A mistake I shall not make again. These days, a lot of people like to pretend that comic books exist in a vacuum. When a popular comic engages with social commentary, many are quick to call it an invasion, a corruption of a form of entertainment that was apolitical. This argument has never made sense to me. Comic books have always been political in that they have always been shaped from their very beginning by politics, by censorship, by social justice, by social injustice, by revolution against corrupt and outdated institutions. To ignore this fact is to ignore the decades and decades of history that shaped the art form as we know it today, the history that comics were always an active participant in, both in France and in America. One would assume, as I did, that these countries, their industries and cultures, developed more or less in isolation of each other, that they were similar but disparate, parallel lines never to cross over. But in fact, they are not. They have evolved together, crisscrossing and converging across the Atlantic from their very beginning. This project and the art form of comic books, by whatever name you know them, demonstrate the invisible connections that exist between artists and the cultures they create within, between art, commerce, and ideology, and between societies, peoples, and histories. So I leave you with two lessons. One, nothing exists in isolation. And two, history has proven time and time again that just when you think you figured them out, comic books will always surprise you.